Okay, welcome to another sustainability happy hour. My name is Pat Keys. I'm the lead scientist at the School of Global Environmental Sustainability at Colorado State. This is my co-host, Micah.
I'm Micah. I'm the communication specialist with SoGES.
And today we're going to depart a little bit from our sort of normal, I guess you could say, TGIF style show. What'd you say?
I was going to say our normal lighthearted affair that we normally try to have.
Kind of just because of everything happening right now. And we thought a lot about whether or not we should do this again, where we should have another broadcast at all, given the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and protests that are happening around the country right now, and the ongoing violence that's taking place towards the protests and towards Black people in general. And so we thought a lot about it, and we thought, this is an opportunity for us as here two white people to have a conversation about the fact that this is not a problem. This is not an issue that is limited to a single sector of society. And it is absolutely an issue that needs to be addressed and talked about. And people need to do something specifically in the white community. And so with that, we thought, well, we should still do the show, but we're going to do it a little differently this time.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, I was just going to give a little bit of background. If you have been living under a rock, this is what has been going on. On May 25th, George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, died in Minneapolis, Minnesota, after an officer named Derek Chauvin, who was white, knelt on his neck for almost 9 minutes while he was handcuffed. This incident was caught on video camera or on cell phone camera. And when this appeared online, that is what sparked the protests that started in Minneapolis. I'm from Wisconsin. I'm from a small town just outside Minneapolis. And so I was keeping an eye on it very closely. And since then, there have actually been protests in all 50 states in America and in 18 different countries, which has, I saw one article that said that this makes it the largest civil rights movement in history. And yeah, I don't know how much more background we need to go. Obviously, George Floyd is not the only unarmed Black man that has been killed in police custody. There are names upon names. Black Lives Matters, the movement started in 2013 after the killing of Trayvon Martin, who was a teenager walking home from a gas station with Skittles. And so what has happened now is that I just feel like this has become a moment in time that is not going to go away anytime soon, nor should it. And it's a big moment in time, and we want to use this show to kind of talk about what we as white people, as allies, are going to do, and then also we both work in the field of sustainability with SoGES, and what needs to happen on a larger scale.
Right. And so with that, we're going to have a guest today who has experience in different aspects of this kind of dialogue, both in terms of racism, in terms of environmental justice. And it is, he's Professor Josh Sbicca. I was going to say associate professor, and then I was like, wait a second, if he's full professor, that's a huge dig. So I'm not going to say that. I'll just say he's a professor. But I'm going to go ahead and add you to the stream right now. And you're live, Josh. Here we go.
Hey, folks.
Welcome.
Good to be here. Thanks.
Welcome today. And actually, can you clear it up? Are you full professor? Or?
I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology. I have the extreme privilege of just having learned. I received tenure and promotion about a month ago. So,
oh wow,
feeling honored and privileged.
Absolutely. Well, welcome. Thank you for making the time today during this. I mean, it was already an exceptional time with the pandemic, with everything happening. And this only underlines the recent protests, the demonstrations, and the movement that is taking place right now further underlines sort of this transformational potential of the moment. And so one thing that I would like to begin with as we're starting to have this conversation is maybe you could just share a little bit, Josh, about kind of your background in this, this broad field that I sort of alluded to. And then maybe we've got a few discussion points and dialogue that we wanted to talk about a bit more. But if you don't mind, maybe we could start there.
Sure, absolutely. So I guess I would just begin by saying that I come at my study of the environment and food systems through a lens of equity and justice, and that's always been my framework and background. And it hasn't been sustainability per se that I've been interested in, although I find myself in conversation with folks who are in that arena. The background, in some respects, stems from activist experiences during my undergrad years. I went to Santa Clara University in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the first major movement that I was part of was the anti-war movement in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. And in particular, if you remember that moment, that invasion was based on false intelligence and a false pretext of weapons of mass destruction. And a lot of people at the time period were viewing this imperialist endeavor as something to gain access to oil. And if you think about the nature of who lives in Iraq and the use of the U.S. military historically to gain access to natural resources, this is very much an issue at the intersection of questions of justice and the environment. Other kinds of campaigns I was involved with at that time period had to do with labor issues in the food system. So that's sort of the other angle at which I come to my work, is really at the site of the hands that feed us and thinking about questions of justice and really equitably sustaining the workforce. So for instance, supporting a campaign that was going on, the boycott of Taco Bell by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. They looked for the support of college students, also supporting United Students Against Sweatshops, and our campaign Killer Coke, where it was a campaign to identify the human rights abuses of Coca-Cola throughout the global South. And a lot of those experiences have shaped then the way in which I approach questions of justice in the environment. I went to the University of Florida to get my PhD in the Department of Sociology, and my dissertation focused on food justice and the food justice movement. And so a lot of my work really looks at the intersections of systems of oppression, social movements, and food culture and the food system.
Great, thank you for that introduction. So I guess to start off here, again, I guess I want to, if you're just joining us now, I think we got one more person watching right now. Part of the reason that you see three people here that are all white having this conversation is that the recent events are not a thing that is limited to people who are only Black or people of color to have a conversation about. In fact, I think it's as important for people who are white to be having these important conversations about systemic racism, pervasive racist policies, and the responsibility that exists for all people to start thinking about what it is that we need to do individually in our communities and culturally to address these injustices, as well as create greater equity. And we have a set of questions, and I just closed the spreadsheet. Micah, do you have those questions ready?
I do.
Okay. Amateur mistake there.
The ones that you put in at the very beginning?
Well, just to dive in.
Gotcha. Well, I think I'll just start off by saying, as I was kind of preparing for this, not gonna lie, I was a little bit nervous. One thing that white folks that often holds us back from having these important conversations and doing this work is the fear that we're going to say something wrong or do something wrong. And that is simply something that we need to get over. The idea that, I mean, I can almost guarantee you I'm going to say something wrong or problematic in the next 40 minutes. And maybe I'll get called out for that. And that's just something that I need to get over as someone with white privilege, because the consequences and burden of getting called out for saying something wrong or unintentionally racist are not as high as the consequences that people of color live with every day in a racist society. And so I think what I just want to read something that I read in an article today, just by a website called witanddelight.com. I don't actually know anything much about that website. But she started her article with this. This week has been uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. Recognize that the ability to move past these feelings that have been brought up in response to George Floyd's murder is an absolute privilege. The people who move past them are those who don't harbor continual fear over the same thing happening to themselves or their loved ones. Systematic injustices can only become invisible if they don't affect you. And she says we need to sit with our discomfort instead of ignoring it and reflect on our own privilege and how we can do better for Black people in the future, and then decide what actions you're going to take going forward. And that also led me to reading a lot about white caucus groups, which are specifically groups of white folks to talk about race and racial injustice without people of color there, in admitting that, you know, it's not their burden to teach us things, and especially things we can easily Google. And so that's why I'm excited to be having this conversation today.
Right. And so thank you for that, Micah. One of the things I think that we can do a little bit right now is Micah, you've already sort of explained what's happening right now, sort of the moment. I think it's reasonable, though, to provide a little bit of context. And I don't mean necessarily specifics, but putting the fact that this is not somehow a random explosion of violence or a random explosion of protest with corresponding police violence. This is a problem that has been around for a long time in terms of pervasive racism and systematic consequences that result from that. And so I thought that would be a little bit useful. And Josh, I would encourage you to just chime in, interrupt us, whatever you would like to do as we're part of this conversation. The way that I came at this actually is a few years ago, I realized that I really understood American history terribly. It wasn't required in any of my education, really, aside from sort of required whatever grade school, high school classes. And so as I started diving into understanding American history a little bit better, I realized just how racist the history is that we have. And that sort of made me want to learn more about that, because I was embarrassed by the fact that I understood so little about that aspect of our history, which really is in a lot of ways our history. It is it's not as though it is one feature. In the United States, the racism was part of the kind of central foundation of what established our country. And so that led me to reading a number of books, but in particular, Ibram Kendi's books, Stand from the Beginning, as well as How to Be an Anti-Racist. And there are ideas in that. There's one idea that I found very useful, at least to me conceptually, and I wanted to introduce that idea right now, which is that there are sort of three modes of operating in our society. One of them is assimilationist. Well, let's start with segregationist. One of them is segregationist, one is assimilationist, and one is anti-racist. Segregationist would be somebody who believes that races are different biologically and that they need to be separated. Assimilationist might say that there is a hierarchy and that we need to move towards a preferred state that is represented by certain races. An anti-racist would say, would oppose those viewpoints and say, no, there is no difference between races, and we need to be working towards justice and equity among all people. There is no advantage across that board. Ibram Kendi is not with us today. If he were, he would probably say, that's not exactly right, Pat. I'm going to explain it a different way. But I took that away essentially thinking, wow, I think for most of my life, I've been an assimilationist, I think, not realizing that there was even a word to call that thing that I think I was. And then in reading more about this idea, especially through Kendi's work, it turns out lots of prominent leaders around, Black leaders through history, have actually passed through the sort of 3 stages. Some of them never left segregation. But say W.E.B. Du Bois, he moves through these, and Kendi documents how he moves through these different stages of recognition of kind of racial equity. Another thing, so that's one idea. Maybe we can pause there if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I would jump in and take even another step back and name the system itself that we're living under, and that system is white supremacy. And Robin DiAngelo, she's a white sociologist, and she wrote a book called White Fragility, which I'll kind of mention here in a moment. But in this book, she defines white supremacy as a socio-political economic system of domination based on racial categories that benefit those defined and perceived as white. And we can see this in really simple ways in all kinds of statistics. So she has some stats for 2016 and 2017. Congress, 90% white. Governors, 96% white. Top military advisors, 100% white. Teachers, 83% white. Full-time college professors, 84% white, and so on and so forth. And so we can see the way in which this particular system plays out, even the current moment, the ways in which we have these converging crises. So for instance, the pandemic is rooted in legacies of white supremacy and colonialism. So for example, the nature of land dispossession of Native Americans and the government's continual encroachment and violation of sovereign treaties with tribes and not allowing them to fully regulate their space to prevent the spread of the pandemic into their communities, for instance, or the things like racial covenants and redlining that have systematically segregated Black communities and put them in environments that put them at increased health risk of something like the pandemic. And then capitalism as another system that converges with white supremacy. You know, you have communities of color disproportionately working in high risk essential work like the food system, and then obviously the racist state violence, which in some respect is sort of the flashpoint for all of what's going on here. But the reason why I like this notion of white supremacy and think it does a lot of useful work is that it explains why we have institutional racism and why we would need to even be anti-racist to begin with. Unfortunately, this produces what DiAngelo refers to as white fragility. And she defines this as a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves, which is sort of, Michael, what you're talking about is, you know, the ways in which white people can't get over the way that they feel about things. I
literally am uncomfortable right now. And
yeah, white supremacy is like an uncomfortable notion.
Yeah.
Like people think of pointy-hatted KKK members. Yeah. And I think that's a misunderstanding of the systematic nature of the way white supremacy operates. Like, it's not about being individually racist, it's about benefiting from a white supremacist society. And that's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but a really necessary one to kind of work through then institutional what you do as an anti-racist.
And I think that concept of white fragility is like, so yeah, like I'm literally uncomfortable and more nervous during this live stream than I have been in the past, because this is a weird topic for me to talk about, but it shouldn't be. And the only way to like get over that is to keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And like keep having those uncomfortable conversations and like sitting with it, which I think is just so important. Yeah, and that's kind of where I'm coming to this live stream right now from.
Yeah, I just a personal anecdote. I remember, I think it was 2 years ago. I think I was sitting in the Laurie Student Center at Colorado State's campus. I was reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. And I realized that, I mean, if you've ever read Coates' work, it's very evocative. I mean, it's a beautiful writer. And, but this book was in particular, it was sort of structured around 2 letters that he was writing to his son. And that's sort of kind of the tone of what they were. And then he would he discussed different experiences that he'd had, particularly as a father, in these letters. And I remember, I have 2 kids, and I remember reading this and feeling how viscerally foreign his sensations were to what I knew as a father and what I knew as a person interacting in the world. And it was, he described these situations where he was experiencing more or less white supremacy, and the system that disallowed him to behave in a way that would sort of protect his child even, and have other people literally threaten the body of his child in a way that was completely acceptable, apparently, by society. And I remember I had to put the book down because it made me so angry also as a father. Like, I had that at least shared connection with Coates. And so I guess I sort of don't know where this is going, aside from the fact that I can, when I reflect it on reading things like that, I can sort of touch or get a texture of what it is that I actually experience in that society, like as a sense of like how I fit into it, how I benefit from it, because I don't experience that fear. I don't experience those emotions of anger and rage in some cases, and other people do. Black people do, and I think that that's finding, at least for me and maybe other people, finding that touchstone of how can you get a sense of what that advantage is. Some people don't like the word privilege. Okay, whatever. You can still get a sense of what that privilege is by thinking about those experiences relative to maybe somebody else, and then probing that a little and say, why is that? Why would I feel like I would never be in that circumstance? Well, if I would never be in that circumstance and somebody else experiences it all the time, what's going on here? So I guess as a segue to thinking about, okay, so Josh, you did an amazing job actually of zooming in and kind of putting a lot of different pieces together in a broader context. I think that one of the challenges, though, and Mike alluded to this as well, is even having these conversations, getting to a space or a place where you feel like you can even talk about the fact that, yeah, okay, I actually am pretty racist. I didn't realize that, and I don't think of myself as that. Like, it doesn't fit this persona that I feel like I have as whatever, a liberal progressive guy who cares about the environment. And so that's a tough thing that's a tough task, a tough ask even. Okay, but how can we do that? How can we move people into the space to confront and be aware, increasingly aware of when they become or are saying things that might actually be racist and reflective either of things that they don't realize that they harbor inside, or are actually just kind of reflections of what's the system itself? How can we kind of move people into those spaces? And I'm not asking Josh for you to give us an answer right now, more kind of a conversation around this. If you have ideas, please feel free to join in. But I guess
I would start by saying that this is lifelong work.
Absolutely.
And that it's interesting, you were talking about Kendi's work and the stages that people go through. And I think it's important to think in that processual kind of way, that just because you don't have all the answers now doesn't mean you'll ever have the answers, first of all, but it doesn't mean that you can't have more answers, understanding and empathy, and work towards and act like an anti-racist.
That's a really
and so I guess my first point would be that this is an invitation. It's an invitation to do the work right now and forever, because white supremacy as a system is not going to be dismantled by people of color. It's going to be dismantled by white people. And that may seem very abstract right now, but it begins with that just broader recognition that this is something we built, and it's something we currently benefit from, even if we're not explicitly prejudiced or bigoted people. We still benefit from it. And getting over ourselves to some degree is part of the first step, going back to what Micah was talking about. Just to give you a quick crash course on what D'Angelo argues in terms of like what's at the core of why white fragility exists. She says that a privileged group is considered the norm in comparison to others. So that's part of it. Like, we live in Fort Collins, a majority white city. So we are the norm in comparison to others. And so de facto, sociologically, we just don't tend to consider anything else because that's generally who we see. But what it means in practice is that as a privileged group, we can avoid objecting to oppression without repercussions. So if we were all to remain silent about what's currently going on, it's not going to impact us. And in fact, it might continue to reproduce the power and privilege we already possess. And then the other thing that is important to fight against, and this is where it's sort of an invitation to begin doing the work, is that an inner privileged group dialogue and perspective that white people don't have privileges. And I think that kind of inner white dialogue is really problematic. And it requires us to be vocal when we see or hear somebody talking in those kinds of ways. And what it means is that we actually have to make other people uncomfortable, including ourselves. And that's the fragility piece, right? You know, we haven't had to deal with the racial trauma and stress that many other communities of color have. And so we have to build that up. It's like a muscle. You have to exercise it if you want it to actually work. And so that's the other piece to maybe think about as like an exercise. There's like exercise fanatics in Fort Collins. Why aren't we, you know, anti-racist fanatics? Like, we have to exercise that if we want to make it a reality.
What you said about like inter group dialogue between groups with privilege, you know, it makes me think about how to explain to people what white privilege is and why some people are so they just balk at the idea when you say those words to them. And one thing that really helped me was the concept that white privilege doesn't mean that your life hasn't been hard. It's just that your skin color is not one of the things making it harder. And it kind of also brings into the idea of like we all have multiple identities, and like you can have some marginal identities and some privileged identities. And what I think is really important and powerful about this movement happening right now is that like and this is kind of a segue into, I want to talk about All Lives Matter. There are many groups of disadvantaged people. I myself have multiple marginalized identities, but right now in this moment, focusing on the violence against Black bodies, I think, is what needs to keep happening. Now is not the time to like divert things away to other important causes. But like right now, like that's what this moment is about. Yeah. So I was kind of wondering if we could maybe dive into, we've got a couple of like topics that we wanted to hit. And I wanted to talk about the phrase "all lives matter" with all of you,
Right.
And what that means, where that comes from, and why it's problematic.
Yeah, let's do that.
So I would like to take a first quick stab at this. And first of all, I'll say that all lives matter is BS. It's the first thing that I want to say, and the second thing that I want to say is that it directly reflects white fragility.
Exactly.
It reflects racial arrogance, as well as entitlement to racial comfort and racial belonging. And I don't know much more what needs to be said about it, other than it's a way to defang a social movement that works to challenge white supremacy.
Exactly.
And so it is a way to weaponize a term in order to gain greater racial advantage. And it shouldn't be seen any other way.
But Josh, if you're saying Black Lives Matter, are you saying that my life doesn't? Is that what you're saying? Explain this to me.
It's just kind of ridiculous, right?
I have something that I want to pull up, because so here's the other thing is the work that a lot of white folks need to do is confronting our friends and our families that you know are we're all racist, but the ones that you know post more racist things on Facebook. Your uncle at Thanksgiving. And it's uncomfortable work to confront people that you love. And then also, like, how do you explain it to them? People that just like believe so wholeheartedly that all lives matter is a task that I struggle with. And so this certainly simplifies the matter, but there is a comic out on the internet that I love that is about the analogy of a burning house. And so I want Pat to pull it up if he's able to.
I am, if I can share my screen, which is always a dangerous gambit. Here we go.
So I don't
Okay.
know, have either of you seen this comic going around?
I don't think I've seen this particular one.
No.
Oh, I love this one. I don't know if I want to read it out loud to you, but I also think it's a testament to like the power of visuals and just sort of like the political cartoon in general. He's saying that we should put out all house fires, all houses matter. And the other person is making the point that, but yeah, this one is on fire. Like that's the one that you need to put out right now.
Yep.
And I just really like it as like a very simple, like, and even puts a little bit of humor into it. That makes it a little easier to have these conversations of like why all lives matter is bullshit.
Totally. No, that's actually, honestly, I mean, there are well-intentioned people out there that still find it challenging to understand, well, why they can't get past that phrasing. And it's probably all sorts of barriers, including an unwillingness or a lack of interest in actually challenging their own preconceived ideas and notions. And that's probably all kind of some mess of subconscious in the background. But to get through to some people, especially the ones that ultimately are probably allies in waiting, this kind of tool, I think, can actually help quite a bit. I mean, even just interacting with peers and colleagues sometimes, having some of these conversations are shockingly hard. Not because I don't want to have them, but because like Josh, you just said, this is a muscle that most, especially white people, have not exercised at all, like zero. We don't even know the history, let alone practice interpreting and understanding the history in different ways, let alone being able to parse and interpret the current events in important new different ways. And so I think things like this comic and other, I guess, popular methods of communication around some of these ideas can maybe help to get people to sort of have a few aha moments, maybe. I guess in addition to comics, what are some other tools that we can, I mean, I know, Micah, you found a couple resources online today, but what are some ways that we can sort of, I guess, even we're all at Colorado State, for example. And while Colorado State is very swift with its messaging in a lot of ways, what are some things that we can do to, like, say, enhance the capacity of these sorts of discussions at our own institutions? What are some of the things? So, for example, I asked the question, so I have to have an answer. Recently, the last few days, Mike and I have helped to draft and then develop a statement around the current moment with regard to George Floyd in particular, but also thinking about anti-racism more broadly and what we at the School of Global Environmental Sustainability can and need to do to push this forward, to think about the long-term efforts and action that are required to actually do something with anti-racism. I think the challenge of an anti-racist stance as opposed to a non-racist stance is the fact that it actually requires action. It requires doing something, and in this case, exiting your comfort zone. But I guess that's just, that's something that we were able to do with our own institution. I guess I'm trying to think about, and this is me now brainstorming, like Mike and I didn't talk about this part, but like, what would we do at CSU? Like, what are some things that we could do to sort of move towards like a long-term exercise regime, not just trying to get fit for the 5K, but think about like, what if we actually want to make a lifestyle change here? Like, what are the things that we need to do, like diet changes and lifestyle changes? And I don't have an answer here aside from, as an educator, I think, okay, well, that means I need to include this in how I educate students, how I'm educating myself, what things I choose to put in my brain and what things I choose not to do, and be intentional about that. That's a pretty typical academic mindset.
I mean, another thing, sorry, Pat, another thing is to think about, and I like this conversation because it's narrowing in here. What are your spheres of influence? And this is something we can all ask ourselves every day. You know, our friends, our family, where we work, where we pray, where we live, and so on and so forth. And here at CSU, you know, if we take a step back and we just say, okay, white supremacy is a socioeconomic political system, then CSU is an institution that is connected to these systems. And so if it's an institution and an organization, what is it doing at that scale, on that level, to either advance anti-racism or to reproduce white supremacy?
Right.
And so with that analysis in mind, I've been thinking for years in many respects, but this conversation has kind of brought this back up for me. What do we need to do as a university? So for instance, we could be thinking critically about centering environmental justice. If we're talking about sustainability sphere for a moment, centering environmental justice in our institutional actions. So do we have investments as a university in companies that are disproportionately harming Black and brown and poor communities? Should we be shifting our procurement practices to stop buying from companies that are engaged in environmentally destructive practices that disproportionately harm Black and brown and Indigenous and poor communities? And so we would have to develop a criteria that we currently don't have at this university to actually evaluate company actions. And to actually call for that is a pretty radical action, because universities historically have many investments and make many procurement practices that are majorly problematic. And our STARS rating system is woefully inadequate to actually center questions of justice. It is a smokescreen in many respects and really does a disservice to the breadth of what sustainability actually means if we take it to include the social in all of this. And the social is what always gets short shrift, in my opinion. And we see this.
I think it's partly because it's one of the hardest things to do.
It's hard to quantify.
Well, and it's also, it requires, I think, harder work in some ways. You can't just swap out a solar panel. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to be like, I agree. Like, it's the social side gets short shrift, and I think it's.
But on the investment side, I mean, we can look to see, okay, where's our money going as an institution? Like, what companies are we supporting? And there's so much good investigative work on companies all over the planet that it's not just about quantification, it's qualification. If there's a company with human rights abuses, it's not about quantifying that. It's about calling that out and saying, we're not going to purchase from any companies that have human rights abuses, period. That there are really concrete ethical frameworks that we can center in this conversation. And that's what it means to be anti-racist, is to change the conversation. In many respects, the quantification is the problem. It speaks in a language that reproduces power. But when you use new languages and new ways of talking about things, we can do things really differently. Is kind of where I'm at in thinking a bit about this. Like, I'll give one more example and then shut up for a second. The worst part of the STARS rating system for this university is in food and beverage purchasing practices. And I've been watching this for years. I've been at CSU for 6 years, and been actually quite surprised that we do such a bad job when it comes to our score. And what's interesting about this score is that there's one way in which to actually boost up the score in a way that would integrate a greater respect for social justice considerations. And it's by adopting the Real Food Challenge. It's a nationwide campaign to change procurement practices that center food that is local and community-based, fair, ecologically sound, and humane. And if you dive into kind of the way that they measure all this stuff, so they do quantify it, they make it possible to quantify. But if you look at each of these arenas, there are implications for advancing racial justice in each of them. So purchasing shifts could move to support local farmers of color who face substantial institutional barriers in an industry dominated by white men, both in land ownership as well as access to everything. They would support food businesses that pay living wages and have dignified working conditions. So this would benefit the majority of people of color frontline food workforce, for instance. And then there would be a lot of indirect effects where we could completely overhaul our food procurement practices in the form of purchasing ecologically sound food that reduces forms of environmental pollution that, again, knowing this as an environmental justice scholar, disproportionately impact poor communities and communities of color. So I don't think it's by design, but I do think that there's a bit of institutional inertia to not do some of the hardest work. Like, it's a lot easier to build a solar panel and change your energy grid in some respects than to actually redistribute some of your resources to these more equitable kinds of systems.
Absolutely. That gets me to, and then we should wrap up soon, but I can't remember the resource that I'm just looking at some of the notes that Micah prepped before the show today. And she said there are 3 important stages for essentially white people educating each other. Again, without putting the burden on Black people, people of color that continually get asked during these times to provide, like, what article should I read? It's like,
come on our live stream and tell us what the answers are.
Exactly. So there are 3 important stages, and I think we've actually touched on all of them. And I just wanted to summarize it now, which was, so part of this has to be processing these feelings that people have, which means sadness, shame, paralysis, confusion, denial, all of these things. We need to get through that. Okay. All right. Let's say you get through that. Then you have to then retrain, learning new behaviors, concepts, missing histories, ways of seeing that are hidden from us, given white supremacy. And then finally, actions to shift power, taking action to redistribute resources, change who's in power, and alter institutions, which, Josh, honestly, that's what you were just getting to right in the end. You actually gave like a nice cookbook to somebody who, if somebody's listening, they can actually now do something. But I think that, and I think we'll link to this in some of the notes to the show later on. But it actually, so this website, I remember, I think this is the White Caucusing website that you sent earlier, Micah. And it has an explanation, not just of these things, but why they're necessary to actually do in the sequence, because otherwise, if you don't do them, you'll either miss the boat, people will disengage later on in this process. And I love what Josh said too, is that this is a long-term thing. This is not something that we can just sign a petition, boom, go back to our normal life. Our normal life is the problem. And so I think part of this, again, we have to do some of the uncomfortable work of having these conversations with one another, particularly in white spaces, because this is going to require systematic transformation, not just adaptation or change. This is a transformation of the system from what it is now into something wholly different. And for us to even have a vocabulary to describe what that system would be, what that new thing would be, we have to be able to shed some of this stuff from the past. And that can only happen if we, deal with our own emotional barriers, as well as learn all of the stuff that we haven't learned. And listen, honestly, to the people who have learned it already and who've been thinking and talking about it for a much longer time.
One thing that I'm interested in thinking about as we wrap up here is, 45 minutes has flown by.
I know.
And when I was prepping for this, if Josh, I don't know if you looked at our spreadsheet, but it's a mess. It's a mess full of links and notes, and I was furiously going, oh my God, like we need to talk about this, and we need to talk about this, and we need to talk about this. And we maybe got to a third of it because this is a 45-minute live stream. And I just think that like in parting, it's important to think about how scattered this whole conversation that we just has been. And that's okay. It's okay that we didn't, we're not as eloquent as perhaps we wanted to be, or touched on all the things that we wanted to touch on. But also like recognizing that, this moment for white people and white folks that are sort of jumping into this realm for the first time of wanting to be anti-racists and thinking more about all of this than they ever have in their life. It's not a time to pat yourself on the back and say, okay, like we had our conversation, like now we're good to go. And I'd be kind of interested, backtracking one more time. So like, say on a micro scale, we've processed white feelings and we started talking about retraining, and we started talking about action. When we close our laptops, I want to think about like, what are we going to do next this weekend on an individual scale, and maybe on like a larger like scale within the realms that we have influence in, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And like personally,
do you have an answer?
No, but don't ever have any answers. No, I mean, personally, I need to go read a bunch of stuff. Even this conversation alone has like left me knowing, like, I realized how much I don't know. And really just trying to do a lot of like digging into the literature is probably going to be like my next tangible step. Yeah.
I think one of the things no, that's okay. I think one of the things that I'll probably take as a next step also is thinking about like what systems am I a part of? And one of them is actually my family. And that's something else where I have 2 little kids. Now the 2-year-old, maybe this sort of stuff is not going to be so salient yet. Although I'd probably be surprised, I'm sure. But the 5-year-old, definitely, like I can start to have these conversations with in a way that is more intentional, and in a way that is starting his journey early, right? Like if we think about how many years somebody can be a part of something, well, if we start now, he's got a whole lifetime ahead of him, hopefully, that he can now think about and be asking these questions and really challenging the prevailing status quo, because it's not like this is going to be solved tomorrow, next month, next year. It's going to take a long time, and if we need to be working towards that, then that's something that I guess I can actually do today. And Josh, you don't have to have an answer. You're the guest, so like you're not required.
Can I give some suggestions for supporting the movement right now?
Please.
Yeah.
So these are just a couple of suggestions to maybe close things out, and these were developed actually back in 2016. And it's a document that was called 26 Ways to Be in the Struggle Beyond the Street. And so for a lot of us, we either cannot or don't want to be out protesting, but there's other things that you can do if you want to support this specific movement. You can provide bail relief for activists. So here in Colorado, you can support the Colorado Freedom Fund. You can fundraise online for frontline activists and organizations. Look those up in your area. If you don't want to protest, you can bring food and water to the protest area. It's hot out there. People are getting tear gassed. They need support in that way. If you have the ability to provide childcare to protesters in a way that's safe in this pandemic moment. And then obviously the education piece, right? Amplify the protests through all available channels that you have in your life, and then start conversations with everybody in your sphere of influence, which is a lot of what we've started doing and talked about here today.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Josh. That's great. So we should close things out. I just want to say thank you so much, Josh, for joining us today. This is it's a strange time in lots of different ways. And I really appreciate that you've made the time to share kind of your insight and experience with us today. Any closing words, Micah?
Yeah, I don't think so. Go sign the petitions. Go donate what you can. Do the work you can. That's what I'm going to try to do.
Great. And actually, I should mention there are a ton of resources actually that SoGES has gathered from various sources. And so you can go to the sustainability.colostate.edu. And I think right on the front page, you might scroll down a little bit, is sort of our statement that we've recently drafted and put out there about anti-racism against the violence to the Black community. And then below that statement is a lot of resources, books, podcasts, films to watch, articles to read, and go there. You will find something there that you are interested in. I guarantee it. There is a ton of content and ways to, if you haven't begun the conversation, to start right now. And so again, I encourage you to go check that out. And if your institution, if your sphere of influence hasn't started moving on this topic, hasn't started doing anything, go do it. You can start it right now. I give you permission. And you can start having this conversation, and it might mean some awkward conversations either with colleagues or your boss, but sort of like that's what it's going to take. So think of this as an opportunity. You can go get some material on this website, on our website or others, and you can start doing building that change on your own. I don't have anything else.
Yeah.
I would add one thing. If you are interested in the environmental justice dimensions of all of this, I'm on the steering committee of the Center for Environmental Justice, and we also, as many organizations, put out a statement talking about what we're committed to doing differently and new, but also a whole bunch of resources on white supremacy, anti-Black racism, and environmental justice, and you can find that on our Facebook page.
Okay, great, and we'll make sure we link to that.
Mm-hmm. Because ours is, we're just, the things that we're reading, SoGES is certainly not like the place to get expert content on anti-Black racism. No. But we are just trying to put out some things that we're finding interesting. So that's what you'll find.
Okay, right. Well, with that, thank you so much, Josh. Thank you, Micah.
Yeah, thank you too as well. I really appreciated my time.
Okay, great.
Talking. All right.
Okay, everybody. There we go.
Bye.
All right. Bye, everybody. Have a good weekend, and go do something new. Go read something new, and start changing this world the way you can.